Welcome to the BankTalk podcast, the show where we talk to leaders and experts from the community banking sector. Whether you are a current CEO or aspire to be one, this podcast will give you valuable insights and advice on how to run your financial institution better. Each episode features a different topic and a guest who shares their experience and knowledge with us. Tune in and learn something new with BankTalk podcast.
Hi, and welcome to Bank Talk. I'm Charlie Kelly, your host and partner at Remedy Consulting. Today I have with me Rafael De Leon. Rafael is the SVP of Industry Engagement at End Contracts. Thank you for joining us, Rafael.
Thank you for having me.
Hey, Rafael, do me a favor before we jump into this discussion on Chevron. Give me a feel for where you came from and what you do for End Contracts.
Good. Well, again, Charlie, thank you for having me. So my background goes, is pretty much my entire life that I've been in banking. My father was a banker, so I was running around the bank as a kid. I started working at the bank when I was in high school, back in back office areas, and I'll date myself. That goes back to 1980. And I was a junior in high school then. And so that kind of flavored the decisions. And when I decided to stay in banking, I talked to my dad and the CEO, and I said, hey, I'm interested in, coming to work here at the bank or going into banking. What do you suggest? And the CEO suggested, hey, I would recommend go work for the OCC 3 to 5 years. You'll get a broad base of experience, understanding institutions that are both operating well and poorly, and you bring a better perspective versus just coming in and learning one institution. So that 3 to 5 years ended up turning into 32 years that I was with the OCC. I was an examiner in Texas and in the Chicago area for half of my career. And then the last half of my career, I was in Washington, D.C., where I conducted a lot of outreach for the agency, meeting with our partners, ABA, ICBA, the different trade groups, state organizations. But more importantly, I ran the director training program for the banks that the OCC supervised, had banker training programs. So I got used to doing a lot of presentations and teaching while I was at the OCC and understanding kind of the pain points that both directors were having and bankers were having through real honest discussions. So fast forward through that, I finished my career with the OCC. I'm working for End Contracts. We are a software as a service company that provides integrated risk management and solutions. And our mission is to really continually improve our clients' ability to manage risk and compliance. And we do that by, having unrivaled industry expertise. It's one of the reasons that I'm here. I've seen the company grow. We're at 15 years. So we provide a lot of experience with that. In addition to, and I think, again, this brings my career full circle, I'm on the board of directors of a bank called Main Street Bank in Fairfax, Virginia. I live in Washington, D.C. So kind of bringing my full experience into running around and working at the bank in different capacities through high school and college to working as a regulator. I'm now working for a company that helps to solve solutions, risk and compliance issues for banks, and then being on the board of directors. So all of this, I have to tell you, I'm very passionate about the survival of the financial services industry.
Excellent. Yeah, that's a great rounded background to be able to say that. Right. I mean, in the end, it's a lot of challenges out there for everybody, and it sounds like you've seen quite a few of them.
Right.
So could you do me a favor and I wanted to spend some time with you around this Chevron decision. So tell me about the Chevron decision, how it pertains to banks. What does it mean for our industry?
Glad to do that to the best of my understanding. I'll make a disclaimer up front. I'm not an attorney, so I've not gotten into this. My background is much like yours. Like, how is this impacting our industry, and where did I see this, especially when I worked for the OCC, and what are some of the really pros and cons of that? But we look at the Chevron doctrine, which was implemented, in 1984. Is when this came up. And this was a case between Chevron Oil and the Natural Resources Defense Council, an advocacy group, for climate and issues. And this really came up in terms of the agency, EPA's decision in terms of how they would implement rules that were implemented by Congress. As we know that banks and credit unions have to follow a lot of rules, and it's up to the agencies a lot of time to interpret those rules. And again, in a problematic or challenging environment that we see on the Hill, where it seems like nothing gets done, we don't always have the details in there. And so the Chevron, doctrine allowed agency to do their interpretation of what they saw in the legal statutes. So I think, again, I think about it very simplistically, that if you imagine you have a school with a principal and teachers, and the principal makes the big rules, and sometimes the rules aren't very clear. So the teachers have to figure out what the principal really meant and make more specific rules for their classrooms. And the Chevron doctrine is kind of like that. It's a rule that says when a law is made by Congress, the principal, and it's not very clear, the government agencies or the teachers have the power to interpret and fill in the details. As long as their interpretation is reasonable, the courts, like the school board, will usually go along with it. So that's where we kind of start and what the issue. So with the recent overturn, this Chevron decision, it seems like it can be a win for financial institutions in terms of there's a lot of concern about CFPB or overreach by the agencies, kind of the administrative state as people talk about it, and concerns about that. But my concern is, and we'll kind of lay some of these out, that it's also a double-edged sword because it can introduce a lot of ambiguity. The federal courts have relied on Chevron in over 18,000 cases, mostly upholding agency or interpretations. And now that, the Supreme Court has changed that. So what are the implications for financial institutions? Banks and credit unions are subject to, basically old and broadly worded statutes that are often interpreted by the NCUA, the OCC, the Fed, the FDIC, and even now the CFPB. And so banking agencies, like other regulators, have previously been given judicial deference in many interpretations. So again, where it ends up being a double-edged sword is where some bankers may welcome, challenges to regulations like Basel III or climate-related risk management practices or guidance. The interpretations can also have potential consequences. And so we're seeing this now that different of the trade associations have sued the agencies because of overreach. And some of these have to do with a lot of different things, whether that's overdraft fees or credit card late fees or, junk fees in general. What does this mean? But I think in an increasing kind of polarized atmosphere that we see, it's, when Congress isn't acting, who is stepping in to fill the void? We're all concerned about when we do see executive orders done by either administration, and it kind of becomes a fait accompli, that they're moving along with that. I think, again, the thing that we miss in the kind of perspective is, I go back to the example of during COVID, as Congress was, passing laws about PPP, the Paycheck Protection Program, and what was going to be happening and money that was going to be dispersed. I know I was still working at the OCC. There were a lot of questions that they had, bankers and they had about how is this going to be implemented? What is it going to do? Well, the agencies kind of filled in the gaps, and you didn't hear many people complain. It was like you're trying to get answers in real time for real real problems and issues that everybody was facing. And how do we get this money out the door? And Congress didn't have that ability to kind of spell out all of those details. But you didn't have a lot of questions on that because it really directly, favorably impacted banks. It favorably impacted customers in our economy.
Yeah, when you're giving out money, usually goes that way, doesn't it? Yeah. Okay.
Right. And yet with the Chevron decision is what I see in here is every change, regulatory change, whether it's done by one administration or another, cost a bank or credit union money. I was just reading this past week that the FDIC just changed the definition of broker deposits from what it was and what had been established during the previous administration, the Trump administration, and now we have this. Well, All right. We had previous definitions of, what that broker deposits look like. That was changed and eased up a little bit. So bankers made, different choices. And you can say that it increased risk or it didn't. And there's that concern. Now that's been changed again. Banks are the one that are caught in the middle. And that's really my concern around the kind of Chevron doctrine and what's going on. I do get the fact that there seems to be overreach in terms of what is going on. The CFPB has really been the lightning rod on a lot of these things. You saw them reach into their talk about UDAP, unfair, discriminatory abuses, acts and practices, and include that in part of their exam manual, which wasn't part of those things that are done. So you've seen some of these things that seem very slippery on one side. It happens on both sides of it. But without Chevron, agencies can really kind of struggle to establish any guardrails in areas where the federal law hasn't caught up. And especially like with technology, AI is a good example. Crypto and blockchain is another good example. And so where I continually see this, that I hear this from the industry and leaders at the different institutions are like, well, we need to know what the regulators are thinking. We need to know what they're thinking about AI or what they're thinking on these different areas. Well, without this, you really don't have a sense. And yet the regulators don't want to come in too soon to squash AI and innovative practices, much like we're seeing on third-party risk management now and how we're managing third parties. But we're also seeing the evolution of where the complexity and the risk are increasing. Banks are, more and more connecting with outside partners. And I would say very simplistically, we know that banks and credit union relied on their core provider, and that was pretty much their main vendor. They had one person and the core, was providing everything, albeit it was very limited. Well, as the industry continues to evolve and there's this rapid pace of digitization, and there's been also this unbundling of banking services like payments. We now have PayPal, Venmo, Square, Cash App, all these different things that enable people to do banking differently that meet consumers' needs, yet is outside of the financial system or part of it, but ancillary. So how do banks compete? They're having to partner with third parties, but it introduces a different layer of risk. So we've been seeing a lot on third parties and, guidance. There was a recent statement that was put out this week, but let me stop there and let's see what question you have.
Yeah, I had a kind of a sub question there. So an overturn of the Chevron decision sounds like all good things for the bank. Like my argument would be the bankers' PACs, they would be arguing probably in Congress for a law that might overturn that. That's the only way that would work. They're not going to affect the Supreme Court decision. But as I think about it, I can only think about good things that come from less regulation. Right? As a banker, you were talking about maybe some of the bad things. Is it just the fact that for bankers, with Chevron being overturned, is it the fact that the guardrails have come off and now the agencies don't know how to interpret anything? Or could you give us a little more detail around what's bad, what would be bad about?
So I think, again, some of the, bad things that could happen is it's now left up to a court's discretion to make that change. So you could have a district court in New York decide, and we're starting to see this is how we're going to apply this in this area. This is our interpretation. And yet California may take something, a very different approach, or Florida or Texas. And yet you have banks that are operating in each of those jurisdictions. What does this mean and how is this going to impact? So I think that regulatory uncertainty creates unease. Let's just look at CRA modernization, which is impacting, really banks. It's not impacting credit unions. That's just about to be implemented. Well, if that gets challenged, or 1071, we've seen a lot of challenges around 1071, small business loan data collection. And we're seeing that and like, oh, do we stop? Do we go? Is the CFPB, constitutional? Is it funded appropriately? And all the questions that we've kind of seen. And yet there's questions that like, well, this isn't what the law intended. Whether that's right or wrong means I have to stay attuned to every change that is going on and every interpretation because my institution is moving day to day. And if
Yeah, I
I'm
got you. I got you.
unsure of anything, that really provides a lot of angst. Bankers like certainty. They want to know what the regulators are expecting and not. And they like predictability, and that predictability provides clear standards for the courts to follow when
Yeah. At least they're
reviewing
making a point to
agency
something, you're
actions.
saying.
It allows a lot more flexibility for agencies to adapt regulations and continually changing circumstances without constant legislative intervention. And again, to me, this is the challenge in this legislative environment that we're seeing, that we can't get anything past the line.
Yeah, I got you. Okay, that makes, I mean, honestly, I think as you say that, I think about, and I hate to use this as the analogy, but, sort of the Roe versus Wade, right?
Yeah.
So now that's been overturned, good, bad, or otherwise. It pushes a lot of decisions out to individual state courts.
Right.
And maybe that was their intent, but sort of the same concept. Meaning without a law in place, you send it back to many, many places to be argued.
Right. And so, Charlie, your point there is all of a sudden the court is deciding on some of the things. And this is where, I saw kind of with the, benefit of hindsight while I was at the OCC, you have people that are looking at these policy issues that become, laws or regulations or even guidance around, hey, how should this be handled? Without that guidance, banks are at a uneven foothold. And yet the agencies have a lot of discretion to implement safety and soundness standards. And so if the bank or credit union is not operating in a safe and sound manner, the agencies have the ability to take action on them. But if you don't have a clear line of sight in terms of what those expectations are, you're then really caught up with, oh, all right, here's what, the examiners are deciding. And you don't have a really fresh argument to say, hey, this is what the statute said. This is what we were doing. Here's where we are. And I'm like, yes,
it becomes a free for all, more or less. I mean, to some degree, it becomes everybody wants to interpret it their own way. And that's not always good either. I mean, to some degree, you got to say, we're going that way, right? We're going in that direction. And once you say that, at least it sort of focuses the attention on put somebody in charge of policing it, not just
right.
leaving it wide open.
Let me give you another example. Again, we're going to travel from Chicago to Milwaukee, and yet we've got these laws out here on speed limits. They're understanding this is what we have, how fast we can drive, what we're going to do, and how we're going to operate it. There's a very big difference in risk in terms of somebody driving at 70 or 75 miles per hour who's driving a Maserati or a brand new car versus somebody who's driving a 1963 Chevy pickup with bald tires, and maybe a speedometer is not working. The only way that you have to judge how fast you're going is by other cars, but does that vehicle have the same type of mechanical system? Just because a car is a car and gets you everywhere doesn't mean the risks are the same for everyone getting there. And it's much like that in financial services. Every institution has unique risk and other facets that are impacting them. And so just because some institutions may be moving forward with new products or services, we're seeing that, like, again, with some of these partnerships with the fintechs, doesn't mean that other institutions have that same risk profile. Their risk profile may be very different or increased. So when you have that, who's that arbiter of that to saying, all right, you can't drive as fast in the 63 Chevy pickup, and you shouldn't be driving as fast.
No, I get it. All right. So the way that the agencies get the information about how they might interpret something is either an act of Congress, a presidential executive order, or a court case. I mean, it is sort of a blend of those three by which they pick their guidance.
Yeah. And so again, what the agency is doing is providing the interpretation like, all right, we have Dodd-Frank to implement. Here's what was coming down. And here's our, again, some of these things were vague and not sure. Here's our understanding of it. And yet you have experts who have been dealing in these policy areas for a long time that is going through multiple layers of review. In my world as an examiner, we would be sitting around the table as a group of examiners talking about how we saw things in an institution. And we didn't all have the same mindset as to what was the best way to approach things. It was usually through a combined discussion that we could see the pros and cons on both sides and really hopefully come to a better decision. Does that happen always? No. And so that's the problem. But I would say the larger problem with the overturn of Chevron is now you have courts that are not as familiar with banking. It's going to take attorneys. It's going to take more fees. I think this is a great boom for the legal industry, for attorneys.
Sure.
Because any change is making them money. They have to. They're the ones that are interpreting or suing somebody or pressuring something. But the financial institution is caught in the middle.
Okay.
And so when the courts don't have enough information to decide and understand the different nuances of banking and understand, these may be the downstream impacts or the unintended consequences, they're moving through. And we've seen this with different court actions in different parts of the country. What does this mean? What does it look like? So I think, again, it doesn't allow that flexibility, that predictability. But with Chevron, it really also kind of, had the potential for overreach. And I think we've seen examples of it, and that's going to vary by administrations. The way, I've kind of looked at it is, you have different agency heads and, they're in period place for certain amounts of time to avoid those political situations. But when each administration is coming in and saying, I'm going to replace somebody, I'm not making any statements, all of a sudden that's introducing more change. And so the courts may have inconsistent application. There's more of a potential for political influence. There could be reduced judicial oversight and the complexity for regulated entities. The recent Supreme Court decision that was really looking at, I'm drawing a blank on the specifics of the case, but were they entitled to pursue it, the issue, or was it past the statute of limitations? All of a sudden, they're like, no, this was that gas company that was involved and did, what they were suing. Well, now that changes kind of how that interpretation of the statute of limitations applies or doesn't, which then kind of brings the ability to kind of create more lawsuits. So I think my concern is that it just brings in more litigiousness into an area that's already highly regulated and creating those uncertainties.
Yeah. So the only follow-up question that I think I still have on this is, and you touched on it a little bit, but let's say administration changes, right? If I were to grab your average CEO and he was or maybe a Bankers Association president, right? And say, tell me how many places you think there's government overreach today in the banking sector. And they come up with whatever it is. They go, I can point to 15 places where we feel like the agencies have overreached, right? And we're trying to do everything we can to, get changes to that. If we get a different president, what is the process to stop overreach? And by that, I mean, it's probably a really complicated question, but maybe walk me through. I think you said, hey, it's either a department head change, right?
Right.
How long would it take? And then, that president's got to decide how many of these they can actually do anything about, or maybe the department head does. We're seeing a lot of overreach in that area. I'm replacing that person. And hopefully that person is knowledgeable enough to know where the overreach came from, provide new guidelines. So that was a long question, but I guess I'm just trying to make sure I understand the flow. If all of a sudden Democrats are out, Republicans are in.
We'll be right back.
Are you navigating the complex world of technology vendors? Then consider giving Remedy Consulting a call. At Remedy, we're committed to maximizing your technology investments. Whether you're contemplating a switch of a major tech vendor or renewing a contract, our experienced team can add significant value. With backgrounds in major vendors, we ask the right questions to eliminate headaches and unnecessary expenses for our clients. Whether it's an immediate cost relief in your invoices or a strategic contract protection for the future, we've got you covered. Our experts specialize in core, digital, and more. So whether you're renewing your technology contract or need an outside opinion or a project manager, visit remedyconsult.net. Thank you for tuning in to the Bank Talk podcast. Now, let's dive back into the episode.
Again, looking at this coming election season, again, there's a lot of uncertainty. I've heard a number of bankers saying, well, we'll wait and see, where the pendulum is going to fall, what the election looks like. And it certainly looks very different now. And we don't need to get into any politics about it.
No.
But what I can tell you is over my 32-year career with the OCC, I worked for heads of the agency directly that were both Republican and Democrat. And one of the situations that we find ourselves in right now is the macroeconomic environment is impacting banks and credit unions, where there is a lot of concern about commercial real estate, and especially in the office sector, how these things are playing out. What are some of those other concerns? So long-winded responses in terms of that, seen, both in terms of that, I think any person that steps into the chair of those things wants to make sure, especially for the financial services industry, that it remains safe and sound. We've seen, especially when the larger banks, SVB and Signature, failed, that there were concerns that other banks were going to fail. How stockholders were running. It was the first time we saw a run on the bank based on just Twitter, social media. And again, that changes the dynamic. So what I do see is the person, coming in to sit as the agency head is going to also take a very different look. During the Trump administration at the OCC, Joseph Otting was brought in, and he was a banker. It had been years since there was a banker that was in charge of the agency. They were normally attorneys that had worked on the Hill, that had vast amounts of knowledge about the industry, Democrat, Republican, independents. And so to me, the basics of where we are in environment also matter and play into that. It's very different from when we saw a boom economy and, liquidity was flush and everybody was flush with money and there weren't any concerns that were going on. Now we're starting to see some concerns of probably decisions you and I are making about where we invest our money. And am I going to spend money right now, or am I concerned about inflation and prices? Do I want to wait and do some home improvements, or do I want to wait and buy a home when rates are a little cheaper than they were? Yeah. So I would just say all of those things kind of fall into the perspective. The examiners have their day-to-day jobs. Now, that being said, in a change of administration, when Trump was elected as president, that was, again, started administration in January. I think it was by May that Joseph Otting was brought in as his appointee. The other issue is for a lot of these agency heads, they usually have to be Senate confirmed appointees.
Oh, so
getting then the Senate to kind of agree, on who's going to do this or not, what ends up happening?
Well, so then as an agency head gets appointed, at what point do real decisions come down, to the auditor pool, for lack of a better, let's say there's a 6-month gap to get them in and approved. How long does it take for that person to get organized and start making decisions and pass that on to an actual, I don't want to say decision to the auditors, but certainly some guidance to them as far as how they want it interpreted?
Yeah,
is that another 6 months, or does that just continue?
I think, again, it can be anywhere from 6 months to a year, what is going on, and how long it takes for these changes to be implemented. So a minute ago I mentioned, when Trump began, it was in 2017, and Joseph Otting became comptroller in November. So we saw 11 months there, and that was pretty quick of a process, all in all, from what I've seen in other years. So it's taking about a year. The administration sets their priorities, and then from, the cabinet chair that is there. So from, head of treasury at that point in time or now, they have their priorities that they want to do. Everybody understands their mandates, who's going to step in their agencies, and they're going to try to make sure that they are completing and managing up to those priorities and completing those.
Okay, so if I think about that, maybe I got this wrong, but the president goes in, takes a year to put in an administrative head. And then when you think about sort of the 4 years they have to get their job done, it's sort of 3 years under one president, 1 year into the next, right? Because you have a year to get the next guy, right? The next man or woman appointed into that position. In your experience, has there been sort of a run for the border in that last year? So president gets elected, they didn't replace me. Charlie's the head of something. They haven't replaced me. Is there an extra emphasis in those last 11 months? Does that person kind of say, well, I know I got one year left here. I'm going to go find my next job. So you're not going to see me all that much anymore. Like, what is that period in there, that gap period?
Yeah, you don't see people being lame ducks. They're usually, I have these, priorities, these things that I'm going to accomplish. Everybody's trying to push through like, hey, I was able to meet all of my objectives that were kind of set
in the next
forward.
job. Yeah, sure.
And so there are other controls that kind of play into that. So we have things like with the Congressional Review Act that all of a sudden laws that were passed, it can be, reviewed a year later. And again, I'm not the expert on that, but knowing that we've seen some of these things, we've seen over time that things from each administration have been undone from the previous one. And I think we will continue to see that. And again, that gets to my point, even administratively, while those things are done, there was still certainty in terms of, all right, this is what the agency is going to do and how they're going to do it. They're giving me that. When agencies are, I don't even say that they're worried, but when it's very litigious, what gets held up in there is providing guidance or anything for the bank. And I know there's the issues with guidance and does it have the effect of law or not? Well, at least it gives me some of the rules of the road, the parameters on which to operate.
Yeah, great. Excellent. Well, Raphael, this has been great. I appreciate your input on all this, and it's your background's wonderful for this type of a conversation because it's just interesting to hear kind of what's going on behind the scenes as well.
Yeah, it is fascinating to watch and what's going on. But I think, one of the things I'll just make in terms of one of the last plugs and very passionate is we're seeing the industry change. So any institution, banks or credit unions, really have to stay on top of these changes. But the risk and how quickly the industry is changing, if you've been in the industry anywhere near as long as I have, and you may have been, I've never seen it change as fast as I have in the last 7 to 10 years. And how quickly the industry is changing. And yet we've seen a tsunami of regulations that have impacted every financial institution. So how do they stay afloat? How do they manage
even
that?
In sync, right? Yeah, even lined up with each other. Yeah.
So they have to have really strong risk and compliance systems to navigate the uncertainty that we're seeing. So thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Excellent. Well, I appreciate you joining me. Okay, so that's it for Bank Talk. Thank you for listening today. Have a good day and keep on learning.
Thank you for listening to the Bank Talk podcast brought to you by Remedy Consulting. To learn more about end contracts or to reach out to Raphael, please go to endcontracts.com. Thanks again, and we'll see you in the next episode.